Welcome to Lore Talks, episode 2. This week's topic is Mhach. I'm Elioaux Forgeraunt. I write and produce the videos on the YouTubes.
I'm Niri. I write most of the articles on the website, and I'm doing some more videos now.
Woohoo! Very exciting, very exciting. Okay, so let's do what we did last time with Nim and go over the topic of Mhach, the city that existed during the 5th Astral Era, full of black mages and black spell users, correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, a very interesting city. Not my favorite. Nim is my favorite, but certainly one that gives us plenty of information to go off.
Definitely, if nothing like Mach and Amdapor are not necessarily my favorites, but they are so fascinating and dense as to be compelling regardless.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Okay, so we'll start with the basics then. So when, as I stated, it existed during the 5th Astral Era, and when exactly was the 5th Astral Era?
So the fifth astral era actually comes along after perhaps the most mysterious era in history. Now that we've had Shadowbringers, the fourth astral and fifth umbral eras, and we know almost nothing about these eras because the vast majority of people became essentially Luddites. They hated knowledge and technology. Written language died pretty much entirely. Besides, a few religious authorities would retain written language and use it to sort of propagate their religions. And any technology was destroyed because obviously this was post Alec, so there was a lot of it going around.
After Alag caused the fourth Umbral Calamity, people were just very much wary of all technology after that point, correct?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and like I said, the religious authorities of the era became really very powerful. They were the only groups allowed to learn to read and write, so they sort of rose to the very top of society. But the era ended as all do in a calamity of sort of bitter cold, and all agriculture was destroyed by the ice.
And that is the 5th Umbral Calamity and the Age of Frost, correct?
That's right. That's correct. Yeah. It does seem there's some stuff to suggest that the southernmost parts of the world were still habitable, but a lot of people died, and the Makote actually returned to Eorzea because they were exiled by Aleg. So they returned via the ice bridge from Ilzabad to Eorzea to get to sort of these southern regions where they could survive more ably.
Yeah, and just to double clarify that, because I've seen people confused, they went from Eorzea to Ilsabard and back to Eorzea.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Just worth noting because I've seen quite a bit of confusion on that point, even after people
Yes.
have seen the video.
There is a lot of theories on that. Most of them a little outdated.
Yeah,
But
based off of a lot of
after
tenuous information.
Yeah. So after the fifth astral era is quite simple. Was the sixth astral era, which is when the modern states of Eorzea took form and 1.0 took place.
Yeah. 1.0 would have taken place in the late 16th century, so the late 1500s of the 6th Astral Era.
Right. So right at the very end, because obviously 2.0 and onwards is the seventh.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, with that covered, let's, I guess, go on to the main who, what, where's, whens, and whys. What is Mhach?
So Mach is one of 12 of the city-states of Eorzea during the fifth astral era, later narrowing down to about six, as six of them were destroyed or conquered. It was an extremely aggressive nation that relied really heavily on destructive magics and forging ties with Voidsent to sort of conquer a swathe across the continent. It was also a magocracy and was ruled by a collective of mages known as the Coven.
Interesting. That seems bound to lead to warfare. Like you're inevitably creating a power structure that is incentivizing people to be destructive and powerful, and therefore they are going to want to use that.
Yes, absolutely. And there is a reason that we'll discuss at a later point in one of my prompts that a reason for why Mac became so posturing and so aggressive. Essentially, little big man syndrome.
Yeah, little bit. I guess especially because they had started out as smaller than Amdapor, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, smaller, younger, populated by mostly Lalafell, so literally little big men.
Literally. Oh, fantastic. Fantastic point. Which populated by Lalafell, which is part of why thaumaturges in Ul'dah carry on their legacy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
So then, where was Mach?
So Mark was in an area known as Yefame, which would be, if you looked at Yefame back in the day, it would be almost unrecognizable from how it is now. So it was originally really, really fertile, and there was these big glacial rivers coming down from Coerthas and Abalathia's spine.
Geographically, it's to the northwest of Mordona, right? Between Mordona and
Yeah,
Kurthus.
yeah. So sort of north of Modena, east of the Shroud, and south of Coerthas. Yeah, but like I said, it's become extremely different nowadays, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later. But Yefame is essentially just uninhabitable nowadays.
Hmm. And we covered this prior, but just real quickly then, when was Mach?
So Mark arose about 500 years into the era, and the era was about a little bit over 1,500 years old by the end of it. So Mark arose about 500 years into it.
So Mach existed during the Fifth Astral Era, and the Fifth Astral Era lasted about 1,500 years, about as long as the Sixth Astral Era.
Yeah, the astral eras seem to last a similar amount of time. So essentially, when you sort of look at the prehistory of Mark, you see these little tribes and cultures all around, dotted around your fame, because it's this really fertile area, and food supplies were short in the aftermath of the calamity of ice. Obviously, Mark sort of was a joining together of these peoples, and was pretty unimportant. It was a backwater. Amdapor was the real strongman, the dominant nation out of all 12.
And that was for the vast majority of the Fifth Astral Era.
Yeah, Amdapor was really powerful. It wasn't a conqueror. Amdapor didn't really conquer, it seems. It sort of acted as the UN almost.
Hmm.
And Mac didn't rise in power until about 300 years after its founding, which is when it discovered black magic.
And skipping ahead a little bit, but that falls in line with Shitoto.
Yeah, it falls exactly in line with Shitoto, yeah.
Who lived in Mach?
So with Nim, we have very little knowledge on who lived in there, right? So we only knew that there were Plainsfolk Lalafell there. We didn't know who else was there. We know a little bit more with Mark. It had a more diverse population. There was a lot of Dunesfolk there, but the Midlander here seem to have been pretty prominent as well.
Mm. And are we able to tell that from textual information through conversations? I know we can make that supposition from the corpses that we find in places like Amdapor Hard that are in Machi clothing that are clearly Hurrian in size.
So we can make it from that. We can make it from Césaire, who we'll discuss later, who was a
Mm,
Hyur.
of course.
Um, and I believe that it's mentioned just because of the fact that the people of Yefane were mentioned as being somewhat like disparate and diverse before they formed Mark.
Mm, okay. Not necessarily most importantly, but really fundamental to what comes next in the Sixth Astral Era. Why and how did Mach fall?
So Mark's fall, more than any other state, was largely self-inflicted. Nim was sort of content to keep to itself and trade, and Amdapor, while somewhat domineering, wanted to achieve that hegemony by diplomatic means. Mark was absolutely hell bent on conquest. It was somewhat bitter because it was so minor before it discovered black magic. But once they had discovered black magic, they essentially became this superpower overnight. And unfortunately, that didn't stop there. They started to develop even more destructive magics, void magics. And actually, we have mentioned here that they expanded on sort of Allagan techniques, or at least they learned a lesson from Allag. They sort of perceived of Allag as having made a mistake in forged ties with Voidsent and thought, if we're really careful, if we create sort of safeguards, then we'll do much better than them.
Yes, and I'm sure that went particularly well.
Yeah, it went really, really well. So they sort of summoned a lot of Voidsent, and they developed these really destructive void and black magics, and went to war against a number of states, including Amdapor. Amdapor they went to war with sort of last, because Amdapor was able to force a stalemate, sort of a cold war.
Hmm. And what prevented them from? And I think we touched on this a little bit in Nim, but what ended up leaving Nim, Amdapor, and Mach sort of the last three standing? I believe there were others, but those were the three primary ones.
Yeah, so we know there were three others, but we don't really know anything. We know that Scala wasn't one of them.
Interesting.
We don't know. In fact, we know that Scala died before the War of the Magi broke out. Nim, sort of their geography really helped them. Obviously, they were across the sea, so they could only send flying Voidsent over. And the Nimians had their Royal Marines and their scholars who were excellent at sort of just defeating the Mhachi through sort of ingenious measures.
Hmm.
And then in the case of Amdapor, white magic was this huge deterrent, and so were the constructs, the stone constructs that the Amdapor used. It made their capital at least pretty much impregnable.
And so, what was it? What became the final straw in the coffin that allowed for either Mach to break that impregnable fortress that it was their city, or cause the inevitable cataclysm that it becomes the sixth astral era, sixth umbral calamity?
Right. So we don't actually know a great deal about that. We know that there was a spark, but it's actually commented on that we don't know what it was. There was a gradual stepping up of tensions that sort of led over centuries and centuries and centuries to this war, but we don't know what actually kicked it off. But the war that ensued was insanely brutal. There were countless killed. The land itself was drained of ether, and of course, so severely drained that a calamity was triggered.
It would be interesting to know whether or not the singular spark, because you have the fourth umbral calamity caused by Alag, which does happen in a sense in a moment, right? You have the tower receiving the aether from Dalamud and basically causing a massive shockwave that begins the earthquakes that cause the fourth umbral calamity. I would
Right.
wonder I would wonder if then there is a singular moment like that when it comes to the War of the Magi, because the fact that they had that, then this skips forward a little bit, but the fact that the Mhachi had time to create Dunscaith and the Void Ark would imply that there was more of a gradual oncoming of the floodwaters.
Yeah. In fact, we have some evidence in some of the Eorzean books that they actually knew it was coming before the era started. They had received the signs their seers had found out. I actually kind of have a theory about why it was a calamity of water outside of, Allagan, no, sorry, not Allagan, Asian shenanigans. So my theory is that you look at black mages, right, and you look at white mages, and you look at scholars. None of them have significant water spells. The white mage has a little bit. Um, so their spells weren't draining water either, right?
Oh, that is actually some really interesting conjecture. So the idea being that the aether most left to them would be water because it's the least drained, correct?
Yeah, that's my theory. That is why it was a calamity of water. Outside of the cycle and all of that.
Yeah. Whether we have any confirmation for it, I think there's no reason to assume that it could have been a contributing factor, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's just a fun theory that I've had for a while. In fact, I've had that before we knew about the cycle. So
Well, honestly, I've mixed that with the other theories throughout our conversations that you've mentioned. I've really appreciated them either because they recontextualize small, deep bits of information on how I perceive a thing, and also helps me remember certain key things. That there is enough within this game, story and lore wise, is to have such nuanced. I want to say theory crafting. That's not even totally the right word, but theory crafting. It's just lovely.
yeah, it is. It's such a great part of what we do as well. It's such of a large part of why we do it. I think
Yes, yes. You have to simultaneously, if you were just loving dry history, I mean, you can get a lot out of it, but you have to have a certain love of creativity as well.
you do. It's true.
Half storyteller, half historian. So let's get back to the downfall of Mach real quick.
Okay, so like I said, they saw it coming. They saw the calamity coming, and the nations involved in the war pretty much immediately laid down their weapons. They were at least rational enough to do that, um, and each of them sort of came up with their own plans for how to survive this or mitigate the damage. Because the
Mm.
Nimian plan wasn't really we want our nation to survive this. It was we want to not all die.
There's something about the Nimian wall plan that seems much more desperate than some of the plans implemented by Amdapor or Mach.
Yeah, and I think that can largely be sort of attributed to the plague having destroyed much of their government.
Hmm.
So Mac's plan was to build, like we said earlier, a Void Ark, a big ship that was powered by Voidsent essentially, and that could fly the a large chunk of the people of Mark up to Dunscaith, this sort of refuge.
A sanctuary in the
We
clouds. Yeah?
Exactly, yeah. It's a floating island essentially. But the Mach, either Mach or the Mhachi people had other plans as well. A lot of them fled to Garabania. Some remained and drowned. And we know that at least some survived outside of the ones that stayed in Garabania, because when they went back to Yafame, they found it completely uninhabitable. Because when salt water sort of assaults and stays in a place, you can't farm there anymore. So they couldn't receive food. And of course, there was Voidsent just wandering around the city. And that's why it's called the Yafame Salt Moor, because it's a saltwater swamp.
I just to make clear, you're saying that a demon-infested salt swamp is not conducive to regular life?
It's not, believe it or not, at least not in any sort of organized fashion.
Baffling.
And the Mhachi, of course, in this flood had lost their means of controlling the Void and the Millstone, which also meant that the Void Ark plan failed completely. So Mhachi was destroyed almost entirely, besides some survivors in Garabania and some survivors who would later go on to Fanlin.
Okay. Well, then with that in mind, why don't we touch on sort of the cultural and practices of Mach? Because I think the last bit there, I think touches on both the, nullstone, black magics, void magics, all sorts of stuff. So let's start off with the black mage and the history of the black mage.
Right. So, like we said, the black magic sort of discipline was innovated around the year 800 by Shatoto Shato, who was a Lalafell mage. We'll discuss her a little bit later on. But some sources, this is a little bit of sort of an inconsistency. Some sources state that she found the roots of this magic somewhere and developed from it. Some stated that she just invented it wholesale. She was a genius either way, but
And for any of those who have played the Black Mage quest, a bit prone to boasting. So her own accounts of the events could have done a lot to make it uncertain for everyone what the truth was.
exactly, yeah, I would imagine so. So black magic is unique because it draws power from the environment, from ambient ether. Thaumaturgy, conjury, red magic, all sorts of other magics draw from either inside or sort of reserve sources like crystals or tomes and stuff like that. But black magic draws from the air around you, the land itself. The weapons actually that were used by the mages, so these staves, were originally signs of religious office. They were sort of like things that priests carried, and they just so happened to be made out of materials that sort of lent themselves to casting magics.
For Black Mages, though, before Black Mages existed, was there a legacy of thaumaturges? Was that a ubiquitous part of Mhachi life before Black Mages came onto the scene?
So I would say, so I know that there are some people who disagree with this, but my read is that conjury and thaumaturgy, although known by different names, are sort of common threads throughout spoken life
Mm.
in the world. It's hard to find a culture that doesn't have at least some of them. I would feel confident in looking at Shitoto, who was sort of obsessed with destruction, that she was a thaumaturgist before she was a black mage. And at the very least, the staves that the black mages use were originally thaumaturge weapons.
Yeah, I think I would agree that all the circumstantial evidence we have, and the fact that they would have been able to pick up black magics, kind of, to me, fundamentally implies they would have had to have had some form of legacy in thaumaturgy, even if it wasn't quite as ubiquitous initially as it became later.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Why don't we cover the second aspect of the magics used in Mach, and that is with the Voidsent, void magics, and everything surrounding that?
Right. So just to discuss sort of Voidsent first, then.
Yes.
Voidsent are creatures of the void, or okay, so Voidsent are creatures of the void or the 13th shard. Most of them are horribly mutated spoken, it seems. So, people of the 13th shard that have been sort of twisted and starved of ether by the flood of darkness that hit their home. Others are presumably animals, and then there are some that are just so difficult to categorize. Who knows what they could be? They are extremely hungry for ether. It's pretty much at least the lower ones think about, just getting more of it and devouring it. And they don't really mind if that ether is currently the thing keeping someone alive. So that's why they don't get on so well with most people on the source.
And and that's where the rungs come in, right? The 12 rungs of the Voidsent.
Yes, absolutely.
That is a system of taxonomy that just explains. uh, It is a very valuable system of people in Eorzea saying this Voidsent is this level of danger. If it is extremely dangerous, like the most dangerous, like oh, it's the king of the Voidsent, it would be of the first rung. If it's something like an imp or just like the most nothing Voidsent, it would be of the 12th rung. Correct?
Exactly, yeah. The only sort of core of universal truth that I could apply to that is that it does seem as if the first rung as ruler, second rung as sort of a higher noble, and third rung as lesser noble does seem to hold true a lot of the time.
Yes. The only problem is that we know so little about their society that it holds true for our understanding of what they tell us, but we know how many bad narrators there are within the confines of some of the people we know in Eorzea. So it makes it. I would agree, but also we can never be sure.
Actually, an interesting thing about Voidsent is that they're not only created by the Void, some are artificially created. The kobolds create artificial ones, they create bombs all the time, like thousands and thousands of them.
They refer to bomb breeding, and that always was very. That was fascinating to me because of the fact that it doesn't, like you say, it doesn't necessarily mandate that void scent are come from the void in the first place. Though it does make sense in that part of how void scent function is that they are a soul within the void that comes forth into our realm and inhabits a physical vessel. And so, I mean, if you have a soul in a physical vessel, that's just what we are. It's what spoken are. So, I mean, there's no reason that they shouldn't be able to procreate in theory.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. We do know that, of course, some do genuinely come out of situations other than the void. Anyone who's played Shadowbringers and certain class quests will know about that.
Vital information, as it were.
Yeah, if you want to understand the lore, then you really should be playing the class quests or role quests.
Yes, yes, just emphatically yes. How does Mach then use the void scent in order to both supplement their armies and how did they function within their culture?
Right. So, they used void magic. Now, the first, while the first black mages that we know of are Mhachi, the first void mages that we know of aren't. They're Allegan, of course, who had heavy, interpretate heavy interaction with the void. And Zande actually signed a contract with the Cloud of Darkness, of course.
That is tied to the Crystal Tower quest line.
It certainly is. Yeah, you can find more about that in there. But the Mhachi sort of represent, or seem to think they represent, a refinement of these techniques. Mostly, this refinement seems to be that they create safeguards. So they create the nullstone, they create binding techniques, stuff like that. We don't know much about void magic. They can tear portals into the void. Most people who summon void scent and don't use proper void magic just sort of usher lesser Voidsent into a shell, into a corpse of a livestock or something like that. But the Voidsent are able to actually create a physical portal.
And the shells that void scent inhabit are limit the power that the void, regardless of how strong the void scent is. If it's inhabits a weak shell, it is weakened by that.
Yes, and the Maki seem very, very cogent at this. They use this with Skaha, which we'll discuss later.
How did they go about trying to keep the void scent under their control?
So it seems as if an individual void mage is able to exert direct control to a degree, but they actually seem to give the void scent quite a lot of leeway because they send armies of them out without really much supervision. And the way they control them is using the nullstone. So to discuss the nullstone, it's essentially a super weapon, but a very restricted one. It can only affect void scent by sort of banishing them instantly if they break their pact. It seems to be mostly used against the really high-ranking void scent.
But its power was to specifically sever the soul of the void scent from its vessel and therefore force it back into the void. Yes?
Right. So there's a little bit of inconsistency here as well, which is interesting. So certain sources in the lore say that only that when you use proper void magic, only the really strong void scent need physical vessels. You can pull other ones in without. It seems to imply that. Whereas the nullstone being used against all of them sort of implies that all of them had physical vessels. So what I would imply is that it's able to essentially just, for want of a better word, yeet lesser Voidsent out of the source.
I mean, frankly, I think that is the most apt term you could use. I mean, you think about how what Cat Sith does to Diablos, and I think that yeeting is appropriate.
Yeah, I think you've got a point there. But with stronger ones, it absolutely, you are right. It cuts this tie between the physical form and the actual body of the Voidsent.
With that in mind, then, how did the Void Ark function? Because specifically, it seems that it's powered by Voidsent. Were they trapped, or how does it feed on them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Void Ark is an act of hubris on a grand scale, which is very Mhachi. They like to do stuff
That's
like that.
quite apt.
It's a huge airship, huge enough to carry either a majority or a significant chunk of Mark's population, livestock, rations, seeds, supplies, everything that they needed to sort of restart. And the Ark, like you said, was powered by Voidsent. And they sort of seal these Voidsent in the ship inside these big sarcophagi. And they don't actually seem restricted to the ship because we know of them being used elsewhere with Calawais.
Yes, these Mhachi coffin devices are seen in the Red Mage quest as well, both with Calawais and Lilith.
The Ark is, if you go into there, if you've done the raid, you see just the walls are covered in these coffins, and each one has, or more likely had, a Voidsent in it. And they were enough to sort of power it, but to get it actually off the ground and to push it forward, they needed a really, really big one. So, again, in an act of legendary hubris, they decided to get a ruler, a first ranked ruler of the Void, Skaha, and shove her into a really big one, which was insane because they are extraordinarily powerful and wise.
It would basically be akin to have summoning the cloud of darkness directly into our world in order to power a car.
Essentially, yeah, pretty much. And to make it even more insane, the Nullstone, which, as we discussed, allowed them to counter Voidsent, was gone. It was covered by the floodwaters, so they couldn't actually use it. So what they did instead was put, and we'll discuss this character a little bit more later, the incredibly talented and kind, which is the only time that you'll hear me say that about someone who lived in the Fifth Astral era, High Void Mage, Cessair Blackwind. She was given command of the Ark and was told to essentially keep all of the Voidsent under control, especially Skaha. And Cessair really disliked the idea of the Void Ark. She told them that it was reckless and arrogant and dangerous.
Since we're here, why don't we just talk about her a little more? She was also responsible for summoning Diablos, but
Yes,
not desirably. She was very much a protester of the entire of Mock's disposition for warmongering.
yes. So she was arguably, from what we read, she seems almost like the greatest mage of Mark, at least in her lifetime. She was able to summon and bind really, really powerful Voidsent like Diablos and Skaha. And I think we can forgive her for not being able to control Skaha and thousands of Voidsent personally.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also they make reference to the fact in the Void Ark quest line that the main reason that the Void Ark seemed to have failed is because Diablos is the one who taught them how to use many of the magics for it, and that he had inherently sabotaged what they knew.
Yes, Diabolus is very cunning and sabotages all of that.
Yeah, so I think she did not only better than could have been expected, but she did everything right, and sadly gave her life to make sure that even when it failed, it was still the world would be safe.
Yes, so she did. So where Mark was this deeply bloodthirsty conquering nation, Cessair wanted either peace or at least a little bit of temperance in how they did war. Although she summoned Diabolos, she summoned him to act as a deterrent. But the Coven, the ruling body of Mark, said, no, I think we're going to throw him at Amdapor. And like you said, her final act was sealing Skaha within the sarcophagus. That was the last thing she did before she died.
Since we're hitting on the Void Ark, why don't we then talk on where it was headed with
Right.
Dunscaith?
So Dunscaith is this pre-constructed refuge, essentially sort of a mini city built atop a floating island where the Void Ark would dock and the people of Mhach would get out. The Ark, of course, didn't reach it, at least not with any people alive on it. But Dunscaith was really rather beautiful. It had these big lush gardens, this elaborate sort of castle-like structures and manors and terraced houses all throughout it. Sort of semi-Victorian inspired to my eye.
Yeah, very much so, though it's in a way that's distinctly clean and elegant rather than not to say that Victorian architecture isn't elegant at all times, but when you tend to see it presented, it's often there's a dirt to it, and both even in its own media and its own
Yeah,
depictions of
that's true.
itself.
I mean, industrialization and all that, but just a little fun, a fun fact for everybody here. Dunscaith is a real castle. It was named for the personal castle of Scaith from Irish mythology, and it's a real castle in Scotland.
Oh, that's really cool, and then also makes sense seeing as Skaha ends up being one of the bosses for it.
Exactly, yes. So, if we want to discuss Skaha, again, that is to the best of my knowledge how it's pronounced. I'm not Irish myself, but that is
I think we can be forgiven for doing our best. I mean, there was an interview with a bunch of the voice actors for Final Fantasy 14 recently where they all said, "Look, we have a hard time with these names and are not necessarily sure what the correct pronunciation is, so don't worry about it." So, I think if we do our due diligence and we do our best to get it right, and then if we find out later via, let's say, a word that's never been said before ends up getting a voice line, we'll just change it
Mhm.
then.
Yes, agreed. So onto Skaha. She is, like I said, a first-ranked Voidsent. So in the Void hierarchy, she's at the very top, which normally implies that they sort of rule their own. I'm not going to use the word nation because I don't think that's a fair term to apply to it. But their own sort of
Region.
fiefdom, yeah, their own territory, whatever you want to call it, within the Void. And she calls herself Queen of the Void, which is not quite a true title because there's quite a lot of those who call themselves sort of monarchs of the Void, like Cloud of Darkness and all that.
Yeah, they all seem to think they're the number one, so it's likely that there's quite a few of them.
Yes, yeah, I agree completely. So Scathach was, like I said, originally summoned to power the Void Ark, like a big sentient battery. But the restrictions that, like you said, Diabolus had given them were failing over time, pretty quickly actually, as they sort of took off. And Cessair, and she had 53, I think, Void Mages with her. Used their sort of final moments to seal the coffin so that Skaha wouldn't destroy the world because she was, of course, this extraordinarily powerful Voidsent. And this worked for a long time until Diabolos managed to liberate her, Skaha. Her true form does not actually seem to resemble how we fight her. So, like you touched on earlier, Elioaux, the Mhachi knew that if you put a really powerful Voidsent in a really fragile form, it weakens them. So they put Skaha in the form of a very young, very fragile woman to sort of weaken her a little bit.
Which is why she appears as she does when we find her in Dunscaith as the
Yes,
second to last boss, I believe, of that
she is
alliance
the
raid.
second to last boss. Yeah, the final one's Diabolus Hollow. And she's named, just, I'm not going to do a full etymology section, but she's named for a legendary Scottish warrior woman who ruled in Irish myth from the castle of Dunscaith.
I also believe that that is a naming schema, though I don't know where it's used. That it's a very common practice for the Final Fantasy devs to use, be it Irish or other, Irish, Scottish, or other mythological names for in repetition throughout the games.
It is. So actually, within the Voidsent in FFXIV, Ferdiad, who is a boss from Weeping City, I believe. No, he's actually the first boss from Dunscaith.
And to
And
pour
also,
hard.
yes, and Amda Pohad, he's the last boss of that, is from the same mythological cycle, and so is Cuchulainn from the Void Ark.
Yep, and Kate Sith.
Yeah, Kate says, yeah.
So it's a common thing to see. Not some of the names are come from fully original and are just weird, but often they're from mythological either heroes or creatures or even just historical names occasionally.
Yeah, definitely.
Since we're talking about Dunscaith, then let's talk about Mhachi architecture because as much as we get to see it in the second alliance raid for the Void Ark, the Dunscaith is the first time that we truly get to see like a what Mach might have actually looked like in its heyday.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So, Mark has quite a lot of influences from what I can see. None of them entirely sort of obvious, but we know that most of the buildings are made out of stone. The majority of the houses, like we said in Dunscaith, appear to be sort of British Victorian inspired, although a lot of them are sort of covered in these runic sigils, so that's obviously a departure. Meanwhile, and this is entirely baseless, but just coming from someone who lives in Southeast Asia, some of the towers that are in Mhachi itself, or this could just be the destruction, look almost Southeast Asian, like Khmer or sort of like some of the Indonesian places I've seen.
Yeah, they
Just
do.
with how sort of jagged and sort of turrety they are.
You know what it also reminds me of? It even reminds me of when the British Empire came into a lot of the spaces or other Western powers. They would even when they made brick structures, they would often even still have like that, like much more elongated turret-esque look to them. There's
Yeah,
quite a few places in Japan like that.
yeah. So that's actually I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really. I mean, Mac is the closest thing outside of Allegan, Garlian, and the Garlians. That the closest thing sort of colonizing power that we have. So that would make some sense.
Yeah. Especially if you think about Amdapor almost like a mainland Europe, and then Mach as the Britain over in the corner being like, I'm gonna get you guys.
um, so obviously, the defining structure of Mark of the City is the huge pyramid. These sort of clean sheets of silvery plating all over it, and then the bottom of it looks almost like the Void Ark. It looks almost organic, flowing, sort of almost grotesque in that way, sort of, and then
Looks
lined through with this
Geiger-esque.
purple. Yeah, very Geiger-esque. And obviously that is where Ozma is and all that.
Ah, yes, Ozma, one of your favorite entities.
Yes, I do quite like Ozma. So while we don't know much about sort of the influence behind the pyramid, many civilizations have built pyramids. I just think this pyramid looks really cool, and that's the rationale behind that.
It makes me wonder if it's what is it called? It reminds me of the Luxor in Las Vegas.
I could see that.
That's what whenever I see it, that's immediately the thing. Because even at the top of it, it has a giant LED light, and so like the top of it, its tip is a light, and there's the like near the top, there's the barrier lines that create the false sky when you fight Ozma. So that's just what I always think of.
Meanwhile, it reminds me of the Base Pro shop, the pyramid.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, sorry about that tangent. Back onto sorry your love of Ozma.
Okay, so Ozma is this artificial super weapon, whereas the Nullstone is this really restricted super weapon that only works on Voidsent. Ozma works on pretty much anything that you'd want. It was actually, however, built to destroy Voidsent. It was intended to destroy whole armies of Voidsent in one fell swoop. But later used to destroy whole chunks of enemy cities.
Well, and we assume because the mid-fight for Ozma, when you go into it, basically, you see floating parts of destroyed cities, and very specifically, you see parts of Nimian cities.
Yeah, we would have to assume that it's Nimian. It looks very obviously Nimian.
It has Nimian pillars with the designs and stuff. If it's not, and it's just an asset reuse, it's such a flagrant. If it was unintentional, it's too specific to discount. So it can't.
Yeah.
It's probably not just asset reuse. Also, the devs historically, even at the worst of times, have been very careful about stuff like that.
Yes, I agree. So Ozma works by taking a big bite out of the world, essentially, and subjecting it to something that's called dimensional compression. Now, I'm not totally sure what that is, and it's not explained, but it does seem to contain these sort of destroyed areas within itself, or at least in an area that it can access. So I'm assuming that it's sort of like putting it in a pocket dimension, essentially, and sort of crushing it.
Yeah, my understanding was very much that it is basically if you took, an area the size of a house and put it into a and then compress it down to a basketball size without destroying the things within it and then storing
Yes.
them.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Interestingly, it's a soulkin, which sort of implies that it was an inanimate object before it got sort of filled full of magic and turned into a big spectral orb. Um, who knows what it was? It could have been a big crystal or sort of a Mhachi mechanical device, or honestly, who knows with the Mhachi? It could have been something Allegan. I always like to put Alec in these videos.
Yeah, well, it's because I mean, if you don't know and just shrugging and saying probably Alag, you're not like there's at least a 50-50 you're right,
Yeah.
regardless of the topic. So, um the thing that's so interesting about Ozma though is that the fact that it exists and yet it didn't become the singular weapon of the society. It didn't become like they continued to use void magics, they continued to void sense. It became more of a failsafe really than a weapon. That was I mean, it was a weapon. It was used against other cities, but it wasn't the leading man, strangely.
Yeah, I have to admit, it is a little odd. One would imagine that the tales that we have of the era, which in universe we know quite a lot about the fifth astral era. The people of Eorzean know quite a lot about it.
And by far it's the one that we know the most about. We know painfully little about any of the other astral eras, and what we know of the third is almost entirely about Alag.
Yes, absolutely. So I am surprised that every book written about the War of the Magi does not contain Ozma, especially if it was used on Nim.
Yeah.
But that there are ways to rationalize it. Perhaps Nim was literally so fraught and so destroyed that when Ozma hit it, um, when the refugees fled Vilbrand, they were happy to just forget about it and go back to their simple island lives.
It's also possible that it was so destructive that the people who were destroyed by it, there's so few survivors left that there wasn't a lot of tales told.
Yeah, I think that's entirely plausible.
If it came into play late enough in the fifth astral era too, it may not just have didn't have enough time to be seen in action.
Yeah, it could have been. Who knows? Maybe they were wheeling it out to unleash on Amdapor before they discovered the calamity and realized, okay, well, we need to stop fighting.
Yeah, we got bigger issues now.
Yeah,
Existential doom is a little bit bigger than land grudges.
yeah. So Ozma is sort of an enigma, but a really interesting one, and a really interesting way to put this Final Fantasy IX boss into the universe we all love so much.
It's just very pretty too.
It is really pretty, actually.
And this just because I think we're going to make a habit of this at this point, noting interesting things in the environment. When you fight Ozma, if you look around you when you go up there, it looks like you're outside. It looks like you're surrounded by sky, but it also looks like a really bad JPEG. If you look outside at the pyramid when you're going through the Alliance raid, you realize what you're seeing is actually a fake projection of the sky, and that's why it looks bad because the
Yes.
pyramid at the top has actually 4 bands that are meant. I don't know why they're situated though. I don't know why they have that region where they had to make it look like fake sky, but I guess they just didn't want to be surrounded by regular sites of Mach.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe Ozma just didn't look very good in the dark, so they wanted to be like and they had already built the pyramid texture, so rather than just sculpt
Yeah.
the top off of it, they wanted to sort of like add this little section at the top.
It is interesting to note that assuming that they are magically created, seeing as there wasn't a lot in the way of Forgekin there, that magic has the ability to create LED screens.
Well,
Which makes me wonder about like, okay, are there TVs in Eorzea in the future? I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying.
I could see it. I could see it. Tatara becomes a CEO.
Oh my god, Tataru becoming a media magnate. That is a theory I can get behind. So situated within the pyramid itself is also Califasteri, which is a very interesting and important character.
Yes, I agree. Califasteri is very interesting. So, a lot of people who do the raid will probably look at Califasteri and think a Voidsent, but she's not. She is a chimera, actually. She was a human magus of Mhach who was assigned to defend the Nullstone, and sort of as Mhach fell, Califasteri presumably recognized that the demands of her task were going to outstrip her. So she undertook this sort of dark ritual using aether crystals and voidsent blood to turn herself into a chimera that sort of has prehensile hair and all sorts of magical abilities, and also presumably immortality. And we can talk about her name being extremely similar to Callawise, who also used blood magic to influence a voidsent in the Red Mage quest lines, and the fact that their names are very, very similar. So that's something that I have been thinking on, but haven't yet managed to create a theory for.
Yeah, whether it just be a simple echo of repetition or there being a lineage between them, I think it's worthy of note that the Kellaway's bloodline and its entire narrative around it is dealing with Voidsent blood, and that's also very specifically Califasteri's whole thing. It,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
remarkable enough
absolutely.
to be remarked on.
Yeah, we have to discuss it. We have to mention it.
So, in the fallout of the Sixth Emerald Calamity, we're led to the events of we're led to the exodus from Mach and of the people of both Mach, Amdapor, and Nim to places like Garabania, and that inexorably leads to the founding of Beladiah. So, what is the sort of legacy going on there with those peoples?
Right. So we hear about three groups, right, that survive. We hear about the Void. Oh, sorry, the three groups that attempt to survive. We hear about the Void Ark, which fails. We hear about the people who go to Garabania and later found alongside other refugees, Alamigo
And red magic.
and Red Magic. And then we hear about this other group that somehow escapes, perhaps goes up to Garabania, we'd have to assume, and then goes back, and they find that Yfame is Saltmoor is uninhabitable. And while we don't know that the founders of Beladiah were these people, I would assume so. Just putting two and two together, it makes sense. And the Mhachi did indeed go on to found Beladiah. In fact, more directly than any other state, than Garabania or any of its states, Beladiah is very, very tied to the black mages of Mhach, because after the Calamity of Water, understandably, people hated mages. They destroyed civilization itself. And even those who casted, even the most simplest of magics, the sort of the hedge wizards and all of that, faced really violent persecution. And a number of Mhachi mages fled civilization. They sort of settled in the most remote areas of Eorzean. We're not entirely sure where, but somewhere near Thanolin. But over time, sort of as they sort of preserved their traditions, prejudice dwindled, and they were able to sort of travel. So they traveled to Thanolin, which wasn't really very heavily inhabited at that point. It's a hostile landscape, right? Um,
Mostly populated by the Amalja at that point.
and they actually used their magical abilities to find water sources. So a peaceful use for either black magic or thaumaturgy, probably thaumaturgy by that stage, and settle a town. Actually, they founded a well on a water source, which then became a town, which then became the nation of Beladiah.
That leads to Sildi, Ul'dah, and basically at least the Thanolin nation state that we know today.
Yes, yeah, it definitely does.
We know that Ul'dah's patron deity is Nald Thal, but who is the patron deity of Mach? Because we know Amdapor was Nafka, right?
Right, that's correct. So this is a really interesting question, and there's a few ways to go on this. We don't know, obviously, but I've seen some theorize that Althic could be the patron. I didn't really see much weight behind that. They were saying that he could have been it because of his control of space and time, but that's not really a Mhachi thing. So,
No, that honestly is something that's proffered through multiple civilizations at random points. It almost seems like Althig is very specifically no one's deity in specific.
yeah, yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, Ozma's abilities are a little Althic-y, but
Yeah. My argument would be that it would probably be Nalthal as well. Not only because of Ul'dah's legacy, not only Ul'dah containing Nalthal as its patron deity, but because during the Black Mage quest lines, we find books that were from the era of Mach and the Fifth Astral Era, and they are specifically the books of Nald and Thal. Which, I mean, yes, you could argue could have been written by anyone, but the fact that they're black magic and Voidsent related is, to me, indicates that they were at least of the nation state of Mach.
right. So we've discussed some small rectifiable inconsistencies in this video so far, but
Hmm.
this one is a bigger one. So Encyclopedia Eorzean itself states that Kukuruka wrote the books of Naltal. But then it also goes on to state that he developed his black magic by finding a tome on black magic. So we then have to sort of question which of the two it is. And obviously, Kukuruka thinks that he can hear the voice of Naltal in his head, or of Nald and Thal in his head. So either he wrote the books of Naltal, or he found the books of Naltal. Whichever way, I think it's plausible that Mark worshipped Naltal. We see that the means that they used to sort of confine the Voidsent is a sarcophagus or a coffin. So Naltal is a god of the afterlife, of course. You could sort of link those. So I think it's entirely plausible. And the Order of Nalthal itself, so the one that we meet in game, the Black Mage Guild, and sorry, the Thaumaturge Guild, and the Priests of Nalthal in Uldar, know who Shatoto was. So they have quite a lot of knowledge on Shatoto, actually, we find out. So that could strengthen the theory that Nalthal was the god of Mhach. I also have a theory, which is that it could be Ralga. Ralga is much more convincing.
Ooh, do tell.
Sorry, not convincing. Ralga's theory is much simpler.
The meteor and destruction.
Right. So the Mhachi have comets in their culture with Shatoto, who destroyed a comet to save the world. And he's often related with destructive magics and warmongering. So now that I've looked into Nalthal and heard all that, I think they're sort of neck and neck for me. It could be either of the two.
I mean, the fact that Ralgar is supposed to be a magus, right? And the fact that he is so associated with a comet and all these things, to me, I think makes a lot of sense. The only one that part that runs counter with Ralgar is the fact that part of his symbol being a comet. Oh, actually, I would wonder how long his symbol has been the comet, because there's the no, because I'm thinking about it backwards. The comet that is followed in Garabanya is then assumed to be Ralgar's comet. His symbol
Yes.
must have been the comet far earlier than that.
I mean, it's entirely the fact that they assumed that the comet was Ralga. I would have to assume so.
Right.
If Ralga is not the god of Mhach, he must have been a god of some civilization that had refugees heading into Garabanya. We might assume.
It may just be one of those mysteries that we never know.
It may be something. When I first heard this story, actually the Naltal one, I thought, well, then why did it go? Mark worshipped at Naltal, Beladiah worshipped Azema, and then Uldar worships Naltal. But then I thought, well, Beladiah wasn't as mercantile a kingdom as Uldar is, and Naltal is sort of a god of merchants, so that would make sense. Sort of shifting back.
Mm-hmm. It also makes you wonder, though, if the culture had shifted just a bit to during the time of, living in Thanalin and the sun, right? And how the sun is connected to culture and how Azema's connection
Mhm.
to the sun.
Yeah, I see that. And from what we see of your fame, although this again could be entirely because of the calamity or because of the Voidsent, it seems pretty dull. So, it would make sense to switch away from that to a sun god when you move into a desert.
It's definitely a gloomy landscape.
It's definitely gloomy, yeah.
I mean this with sincere love, but it reminds me of my time in London. um, I was there for 2 weeks. Not a day was not overcast, which I love. Like, please give me overcast for every day. But it was quite of a thing.
Hey, more links to the Victorian
Yeah,
theory.
exact. There you go. See. Okay, with all that said then, why don't we go ahead and talk about our sort of final remarks and any extra ideas that we have? For me, one of the things that I really wanted to talk about is in Dunscaith, you see a prototype Ultima weapon. What exactly is going on there with that?
So my theory with that has to be that we know that Mark knew about Alec, that they knew quite a lot about Alec, and they even knew that they used Voidsent. So they had probably found sort of Allegan ruins, and I would just have to assume that they found this prototype and weaponized it.
One of the interesting thing that I believe it's EE2 notes, that one of the things that makes the prototype Ultima weapon different from the regular one is that it's not pilotable and it's run by a very simple sort of AI program, and that's why it doesn't actually function quite as well. However,
Mhm.
it weirdly enough still has the ethereal capabilities of being able to draw in primal energies, if not quite as well.
Yeah, it is an odd one. I mean, it's one of these things in one of the, in fact, it might be the only thing in the game that I look at and I think this might just be sort of developer caveat. But I would have to say that the most rationalizable explanation is that it's a primitive, but not entirely primitive, form of Ultima that they found, sort of dug up and stuck in that pyramid. No, sorry, stuck in Dunscaith, uh, presumably to defend the people of Dunscaith from any Voidsent that might escape from the Void Ark.
It makes sense. I mean, they would have been severely hampered and weakened. And even if we assume it wasn't specifically for the Void Scent, it could have also been just a deterrent for any future attackers. They wouldn't have the armies at their beck and call
Yeah,
that they would have had prior.
yeah, that's true. It would have just been a utopian society ruled by my favorite, Caesar.
I love your love for them.
I truly do love them.
Just give you a nickname of Kate Sith. So I believe you said that you told me that you had a sort of fun fact to mention.
Yeah, so I got two. First one is that so you know that the Taurus Voidsent, these big bulky Voidsent, they're the one that casts doom in you in
Khan, yes.
yeah. So the Taurus, the first boss of Khan, the one that casts doom on you, that type of Voidsent. There's a comment in EU1. It turns out that they used to get summoned accidentally all the time, and that's actually what the one in Khan is, because priests like to sacrifice livestock in their rituals and then chant over them, and Taurus likes to occupy the bodies of livestock, and chanting and sort of religious acts can channel aether accidentally. So they used to just summon these Voidsent all the time by accident.
Oh, that would be so much more funny if it wasn't so horrifying. Oh god, that's okay, just for anyone listening to this, if you have a chance, read Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1 or 2. They are reprinting them. They are going to be much cheaper to get a hold of. And not even core knowledge. The core information, everything you need to know for the story and even beyond is in the game. But the little details, just the little smidgens of things that are hidden within those books that just add a little extra flavor are just wonderful.
They are. They're absolutely wonderful. And I got one more fun fact. I'm not sure if anyone remembers it. It might be mentioned in the questline. I'm not sure if it is, but Kate Sith, although I believe the Japanese pronounce it Kachi, but
That would be,
I
yeah,
think
that makes sense.
the actual way to pronounce it is Kate Sith. So Kate Sith, the little cloak that he wears was hand sewn by Caesar.
Yes. Yes, it's adorable. And that's why, and he has kept it safe and clean even 1500 years later.
Yeah, it's just so sweet. I love that the devs put these little sort of heartfelt things in the game.
Yeah, when all the little detail, when all the major things matter and all the little details matter, it's a lot easier to feel emotionally connected to what's going on.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
So I guess the final thing then to touch on is, what is the legacy of Mach?
Right. So while we didn't have much to sort of touch on with Nim's legacy, Mark, we have a lot. So black magic, obviously. The paladins. We wouldn't have paladins if we didn't have Beladiah,
Yeah,
which was founded by Mhachi. We wouldn't have Uldar. We wouldn't have. We wouldn't have. Pretty
definitely would
much
have
any.
black
Wouldn't we?
mages.
Yeah, we wouldn't have black magic. We wouldn't have white mages. White magic was formed specifically to counter
Oh yeah,
Mark. Obviously, your fame has become sort of the way that I imagine it, because it's referred to as the Weeping City, and I imagine that is sort of a post era thing that's been applied to it. I
that would
imagine that
make
it's sort of
sense.
a horror story told to people that live nearby.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very, very imposing sight, and obviously extremely dangerous.
Well, and it feels ghostly and ethereal with the like magical flames that just like linger on, and the corpses, the ashkin that are all beyond just the voids, and there's ashkin hanging around.
There is a lot of Ashkin hanging around. That's right. But I mean, we wouldn't see Alamigo in the way that we do without without
You
a
wouldn't have red
mark.
magic.
We wouldn't see red magic exactly. We wouldn't know nearly as much about the Voidsent, I don't think.
No, because I mean, beyond Allegan's experience with them, there was not another culture that seemed to have contended with them to nowhere near the same extent, as far as we know.
Oh
The
yeah,
one interesting thing to note, though, is whether or not Reapers will have in any way been part of the legacy of Mach.
yeah. So that's a really interesting thing to discuss, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's only so much speculation we can have, but we know that it was in sort of Ilsabardian art. But one of the things, there's two things that is interesting to me. One of which is that it would make sense for a legacy, someone in Mach. It's 1500 years of time, right? There's plenty of time for people to go to Ilsabard after the fall
Hmm.
of, Mach and Amdapor, and then be there for a time, and that art eventually becoming that. Or, well, not or, but and it's really fascinating to note that the place you pick up Reaper is Ul'dah.
That is interesting. I'm really excited to see how that goes. on your topic of Ilsabardian migration, I mean, uh, so we have this huge community of Mhachi, or at least this significant community of Mhachi settling down in Gurabania. And a lot of the black mages and a lot of the white mages say, okay, we're going to stop drawing on ambient aether and start drawing on our own aether and become red mages. Presumably, there were some black mages that said, I don't want to do that. And where is there left to go besides back into the place that you've just run away from in Gurabania? You have to go straight to Ilsabard.
You have to go through the oh my god, why am I forgetting? It's the Gimlet Dark.
Gimlet, yeah. And I mean, who besides the black mage, like a community of black mages, they're pretty well equipped to go through Gimlet Dark.
Yeah, yeah, and to make the full journey. The beauty of trying to speculate on a class that you have a paragraph for.
Yes, that's the situation we find ourselves in. I'm not even trying to speculate about Sage.
No. I mean, like, as far as I'm concerned, until I hear otherwise, it's just like, yeah, the Charlans were Charlans and they made Sage. Like,
Yeah.
it's
Okay, maybe I have one small theory about Sage,
yeah, do tell.
which is that their little Gundam guns are related to the bits, the Allagan
The
bits or
Newliths?
the Garlean bits. No, so it's called a bit. So
Oh.
when you're doing a boss fight against a Garlean boss, and those little tiny hovering things come out and shoot lasers
Oh!
in grids.
Yeah, sorry, I just meant the
Nero
Newliths, their
created
weapon.
those. Yes, the Newliths. Sorry.
Yeah.
So Nero created those personally. Recreated them from Allagan ruins. And they're kind of similar, right? So maybe there's something there.
What's interesting to me is that it doesn't seem that Charlane has been as obsessive about Allag as Garlemald or even Eorzea has necessarily been. So
Yeah.
it would make me wonder. The thing that's, I think, to me, the most interesting thing about Sage by far is not even necessarily the specifics. It will be whether or not Sage has developed in between the time of the twins existing in Charlayan and now, or if Sage has
Mm,
been a thing that's been around for a long time. Like, that's to me is, I
yes.
think, what's going to be the biggest defining, like, or not biggest defining thing, but that's going to tell you a lot about the world, state of the world, and about
Yeah.
arts like that.
Yeah. Is it a Mechanist style new
Yes.
disciple, or is it like a source? Sorry, summonist sort of style? We've
Yeah.
rediscovered this ancient technique, or something else
Yeah.
entirely.
Is it something that we find in Labyrinthos, for instance?
It could be, yeah.
The Garlean's forebears were once. Yep, Garlean's forebears. There we go. Yep. The Garlean's forebears were once humble farmers who made their home among the sun-drenched fields of southern Ilsabard. That was until they were driven from this paradise by invaders wielding arcane magics, forced north into the frigid mountains. The survivors sought a means to tap into the reservoir of aether otherwise closed to them. A daring few found their answer within the void, binding themselves to its creatures to gain verboten power fed by the souls of the slain. Once more they took up their sides, this time to reap a crimson harvest.
So that's interesting then. So it's not just commoners one. So it might not be Mhachi, but they could have had contact with them certainly. And it's post Ridorana then. So they've left the lighthouse and the island by that point.
Well, but the thing about this too, so there's two things going on here though, right? One of which is that they didn't necessarily have much in the way of etheric powers. They would have needed someone who knew the art to figure out
That's
how
true.
to. So they could have had contact with at least a singular Mhachi individual, and that's the
Yeah.
person who would have helped them find out about it. Now, multiple cultures are able to experience the void without like needing that. So it's very possible it's not. But it isn't, it is, I don't think this discounts the idea that Mach did not in some way connect to the legacy of Reapers.
Yeah, it's entirely plausible. I mean, there's certainly you could also go. I mean, the Garleans love them some Alec. They may not have loved Alec so much back then, because Solos wasn't around. But
Yes, that's true.
maybe they found an Allegan record or something. I mean, it could really be anything, and I'm extremely excited to go and find out what it is.
Me too. I mean, I'm not having trouble with this, but boy, am I like, okay, do I need to like take a break from the MSQ to go play the like job stories? Just because, not even because I want Sage and Reaper, which I do, but not even for that, but just because I'm like, I want to know what is their lore? Like,
Yeah,
tell me.
yeah.
Um,
So what I did I used to be an Astra main,
mhm.
and what I did in Heaven's Ward was in the early access actually I went back and leveled it. I spammed Quahan, and then I spammed every other dungeon except for Aurum, which I insisted on going and doing Eastern Thanalan levies instead. But I don't know if I'm going to do that with Sage. I'm probably going to go White Mage and then go back.
I think that's what I'm gonna do too, because one, I'm gonna have at least a week set aside for it, so I think I can complete the MSQ within that time. But on
Mhm.
top of it, I'm not worried about someone like accidentally spoiling me on Reaper lore. Like if someone does tell me a thing on that, I'm not gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna be like, oh, okay, cool. Like it's not nearly as big an issue. Whereas like a plot beat,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that would be extremely frustrating.
well, this has been yet another lovely conversation.
Yeah, it absolutely has. We've gotten a little off topic, but I hope that the viewers enjoy that.
Well, on the bright side, I can always add that stuff to the extras for Patreon members. So it's never quite a problem.
That's true.
Since I do the editing, there's no big worries. So I've been Elioaux Forgeraunt,
And I've been Niniri Niri.
and thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you all.
See you next episode.
See ya.
This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday. And comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.